What happens when a man trades everything he is for everything he wants? When the dust settles and the devil comes to collect, some debts can't be paid with gold. This is the story of Jackson Mercer, a cowboy who made a deal that would haunt the western frontier forever. And what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, revenge, and the price of ambition. Before we ride into this tale that'll chill your bones and set your mind racing, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button, because stories like this don't come around often, and you won't want to miss what happens when we dig into the darkest corners of the Old West, where men sold more than just cattle and horses. Jackson Mercer wasn't born a devil. He was made into one. Shaped by the unforgiving plains of Colorado Territory in 1872, where the wind cut like knives and opportunity was as scarce as water in August. He grew up the son of a failed prospector, watching his father break his back for flecks of gold that never amounted to more than fool's hope, watching his mother's hands crack and bleed from washing other people's clothes just to keep food on a table that was more splinter than wood. Jackson learned early that honest work got you nothing but an early grave and a forgotten name. Learned it watching his father cough up black lung in a tent that couldn't keep out the cold. Learned it when his mother's heart gave out from exhaustion before she turned 40. By the time Jackson was 17, he was alone in a world that had already taken everything from him, and he made himself a promise that would eventually damn his soul. He swore he'd never be poor again, never be powerless again, never watch someone he loved suffer while men with money and influence lived like kings. He started small, the way most outlaws do, running cards in saloons where the whiskey was watered down and the games were rigged. But Jackson had a gift for reading people, for seeing the tells and twitches that gave away a man's hand, for knowing when to press and when to fold. He won enough to buy himself a decent horse and a custom-made Colt revolver with ivory grips. Won enough to dress like someone who mattered, to walk into rooms where people used to look through him like he was made of smoke. But winning at cards in frontier saloons only gets you so far before someone puts a bullet in your back or strings you up for cheating, even when you're playing straight. So Jackson knew he needed something bigger, something that would put him in a different class of men entirely. He needed to become someone who couldn't be touched, someone with the kind of power that made other men step aside and tip their hats. And that hunger, that burning need to rise above the dirt and blood he came from, that's what made him vulnerable to the offer when it finally came. It happened in a town called Redemption Creek, which is ironic considering what happened there. A settlement that had sprung up around a silver mine that was producing ore faster than the company could ship it east. Jackson had been working as a security man for a freight company, riding shotgun on silver shipments, which was dangerous work but paid better than anything else he'd found. He was good at it, too, had a reputation for being calm under fire, for dropping road agents with shots that became the stuff of saloon stories, for getting the cargo through no matter what came at him on those lonely mountain roads. But being good at a job and being rich from it are two different things, and Jackson watched the mine owners and company men count money in amounts that made his monthly wages look like pocket change, watched them smoke cigars that cost more than he made in a week, watched them treat human beings like equipment to be used up and replaced. On an autumn night, when the aspens had turned gold and the first snow was threatening the high peaks, Jackson found himself in a saloon called the Silver Queen, drinking whiskey that actually tasted like whiskey for once, when a man sat down across from him, uninvited. The man wore a black suit that looked like it had been tailored in San Francisco, or maybe even New York, and his hands were soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never done a day of hard labor in his life. His name was Silas Blackwood, though Jackson would later wonder if that was his real name or just another costume. And he spoke with an accent that was hard to place, educated, but with something underneath it, something that didn't quite fit with the American frontier.
Silas ordered a bottle of the saloon's best bourbon, poured 2 glasses, and looked at Jackson with eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone into whatever a man kept hidden in the darkest parts of himself. "You're Jackson Mercer," Silas said. Not a question, but a statement, and something about the way he said it made Jackson's hand drift toward his Colt, though he didn't draw, not yet. "You're the man who's fast with a gun and faster with his mind. The man who's never satisfied with enough because you've tasted what it means to have nothing and you'd rather die than go back to it." Jackson didn't confirm or deny, just watched Silas with the same careful attention he gave to everything that might be dangerous, and Silas smiled, like Jackson's silence was exactly what he'd expected. "I represent certain interests," Silas continued, "interests that require men of particular talents and particular ambitions, men who understand that the world is divided into those who take and those who are taken from, and I believe you are the former, dressed up temporarily as the latter." Now, you might be thinking this is where Jackson should have walked away, should have trusted his instincts that were screaming this man was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with guns or fists. But here's what you need to understand about hunger. Real hunger, the kind that's been gnawing at you since you were old enough to understand that life isn't fair and never will be. That kind of hunger makes you willing to listen to offers you know you shouldn't, makes you rationalize and justify and tell yourself that you're smart enough to handle whatever comes, that you deserve this chance after everything you've suffered. So Jackson listened when Silas laid out an opportunity that sounded too good to be true, because it was too good to be true. But by then, Jackson's hunger was doing the thinking instead of his brain. Silas explained that there was a consortium of investors, powerful men from back east, who wanted to acquire the Redemption Creek silver mine, but the current owners wouldn't sell at any price because the mine was producing better than they'd ever dreamed, and they thought they could ride it for decades. These investors needed someone with local knowledge and local connections, someone who could arrange certain accidents and incidents that would convince the mine owners that their operation was cursed, that continuing to dig was more dangerous than profitable. They needed someone who could orchestrate a campaign of sabotage and fear that would drive down the mine's value until the owners were begging to sell, and they were willing to pay a fortune to the man who could deliver that result. Silas slid a piece of paper across the table with a number written on it, an amount that made Jackson's breath catch, more money than he could make in 10 lifetimes of honest work, enough to buy land and cattle and respect, enough to become the kind of man whose name meant something. But there was a catch, because there's always a catch when the devil makes an offer, and Silas explained it with the careful precision of a lawyer reading a contract. The job would require Jackson to do things that crossed lines most men wouldn't cross, would require him to sacrifice pieces of his humanity that he'd never get back. And once he started down this road, there would be no turning back, no moment of redemption, no chance to wake up and realize it had all been a terrible dream. More than that, Silas said, with those strange eyes boring into Jackson's skull, the consortium required absolute loyalty, which meant Jackson would be signing over not just his services, but his very fate, his future, his freedom to choose anything other than what they required of him. It was a deal written in terms that were deliberately vague, a contract that gave everything away while promising everything in return. And Silas produced an actual document, thick paper with elaborate script that outlined terms Jackson only half understood, but signed anyway because the hunger in him was louder than the warning bells ringing in his head. If you're enjoying this story of ambition and consequences, of deals made in darkness that echo across lifetimes, hit that like button and let me know in the comments if you've ever been tempted by an offer that seemed too good to be true. Because what happens next in Jackson's story is going to show you exactly why those instincts that tell you to walk away are trying to save your life. The first job was almost easy, which should have been Jackson's second warning after the contract itself. He was to arrange an accident in the mine, something that would kill a few workers but look like bad luck rather than sabotage, something that would start rumors about the mine being cursed or dangerous. Jackson knew the mine's layout from his security work, knew which tunnels were already unstable, knew which support beams were questionable, knew where a small explosive charge could bring down enough rock to make it look like natural collapse. He bought dynamite through a contact who didn't ask questions, studied the mine's shift schedule, chose a Tuesday morning when he knew exactly who would be in the deep tunnels, and set his charges with the precision of someone who'd learned demolition work from watching Army engineers during the war.
The explosion killed 4 men, crushed them under tons of rock before they could even scream, and Jackson collected his first payment from Silas in a leather satchel stuffed with more cash than he'd ever seen in one place. He told himself the men who died would have died eventually anyway, that mining was dangerous work and death was always one tunnel collapse away, that he hadn't really murdered anyone so much as accelerated an inevitable outcome. That's what we tell ourselves when we do unconscionable things. We create narratives that let us sleep at night. We build walls between action and consequence. We convince ourselves that we're not really the villains of our own stories. Jackson deposited most of the money in a bank in Denver under a false name, bought himself a new suit and new boots, ate in restaurants where they served steak thick as books, and felt for the first time in his life like he was someone who mattered. The second job required him to burn down the mine's processing facility, the building where they crushed and sorted the ore before shipping it east. And this time, Jackson hired help, brought in 2 drifters who needed money and didn't care where it came from. They soaked the building in kerosene on a Saturday night when it was empty, set the blaze, and watched from the hills as the flames reached high enough to paint the sky orange, as the mine owners and workers formed bucket brigades that couldn't save anything, as a month's worth of processed silver ore melted into worthless slag. Jackson paid the drifters and sent them on their way, never saw them again, and collected his second payment from Silas, who seemed pleased with how things were progressing, who mentioned that the mine owners were starting to crack, starting to wonder if maybe this operation was more cursed than profitable. But the third job, that's where Jackson's soul started to crack in ways that money couldn't repair, because Silas wanted something more than property damage and workplace accidents. He wanted terror, wanted the kind of fear that gets into men's bones and makes them desperate to escape by any means necessary. Silas wanted Jackson to kill the mine foreman, a man named Thomas Garrett, who was beloved by his workers, who ran the operation with fairness and decency, who was the kind of man who shared his lunch with miners who'd forgotten theirs and who visited injured workers in their homes to make sure their families were provided for. Thomas Garrett wasn't a villain or a tyrant. He was just a good man trying to make an honest living, which made him an obstacle to Silas's employers, which made him expendable in a calculation that reduced human life to numbers on a balance sheet. Jackson spent 3 days following Thomas Garrett, learning his routines, watching him walk home from the mine at sunset with his lunch pail in one hand and exhaustion in every step, watching him kiss his wife on the front porch of a small house that was well kept despite its modest size, watching him play with his 2 young daughters who ran to greet him like he was the most important person in the world. Jackson stood in the shadows across the street from that house and watched that family through lit windows, watched them eat dinner together, watched Thomas help his older daughter with what must have been schoolwork, watched him read a story to the younger one before bed, and something in Jackson started to scream that this was different. This was a line he couldn't cross and remain himself. He found Silas that night and said he couldn't do it, said killing a good man in front of his family was beyond what he'd agreed to, that there had to be another way to achieve what the consortium wanted. Silas didn't get angry, didn't threaten or bluster,
just pulled out the contract Jackson had signed and pointed to specific clauses that Jackson remembered skimming but not really reading. Clauses that talked about completion of services and penalties for breach, and terms like irreversible obligation and transference of agency. "You sold us your fate," Silas explained, with something like pity in those strange eyes. "Sold us your ability to choose what you do and who you become, and you did it for money that you've already spent and already enjoyed. So now you owe a debt that can only be paid by doing exactly what we require, regardless of how you feel about it." Jackson returned the money, offered to give back every dollar and walk away. But Silas laughed and explained that the contract wasn't about money. Money was just the hook, the thing that got Jackson to sign away something far more valuable than cash: his autonomy, his moral agency, his future as anything other than a tool to be used by people he'd never meet for purposes he'd never fully understand. And here's the truly diabolical part that Silas revealed with the satisfaction of a man explaining a perfect trap. If Jackson refused to complete his assigned tasks or tried to break his contract, the penalty wasn't legal or financial, it was supernatural, metaphysical, the kind of consequence that didn't require courts or enforcers because it was written into the fabric of reality itself by forces older and darker than frontier justice. Now you might be thinking, this sounds like superstitious nonsense, like the kind of campfire story people tell each other on lonely nights. But I want you to hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what happened next proved that some contracts are enforced by powers that don't care about your skepticism or your modern sensibilities. Powers that have been collecting debts since before the first human decided to trade something they shouldn't for something they wanted too much. Jackson refused anyway, called Silas's bluff, said he'd take his chances with whatever supernatural penalties might or might not be real, rather than kill a good man who'd done nothing to deserve death. Silas shrugged and told Jackson he'd understand the terms of his contract soon enough, warned him that resistance only makes the fulfillment more painful, more twisted, more destructive to everyone involved. Then Silas disappeared from Redemption Creek like he'd never been there at all, and Jackson spent 3 days convincing himself he'd made the right choice, that standing up to evil men and their evil contracts was worth whatever consequences came, that he'd rather face supernatural punishment than live with Thomas Garrett's blood on his hands.
On the 4th day, Jackson woke up and found his hands moving without his permission, found himself getting dressed and checking his revolver and walking toward Thomas Garrett's house like a passenger in his own body, like someone else was pulling his strings while he screamed inside his own head. He tried to stop, tried to turn around, tried to drop his gun and run in any other direction, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs kept walking, his hand kept resting on the butt of his Colt, and he realized with horror that the contract he'd signed had given Silas's consortium more than just his services. It had given them actual control over his physical form, the ability to make him a puppet, dancing on strings he couldn't see or cut. He arrived at Thomas Garrett's house just as the foreman was stepping onto his porch, and Jackson's hand drew his revolver faster than thought, faster than mercy, and put a bullet through Thomas Garrett's heart before the man could even register surprise. Jackson watched from inside his own eyes as Thomas fell, as blood spread across the well-swept porch, as the front door opened and Thomas's wife screamed, and his daughters ran out and saw their father dying in the sunset light, and Jackson couldn't stop it, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but holster his weapon and walk away while something else piloted his flesh and bone.
The worst part wasn't the killing itself, terrible as that was. The worst part was that Jackson could feel everything, could feel his own horror and guilt and revulsion, but couldn't express it, couldn't confess, couldn't turn himself in or make amends or do anything that might ease the weight of what he'd been forced to do. The sheriff investigated, of course, interviewed everyone who might have had a grudge against Thomas Garrett, but nobody suspected Jackson because he had no motive, no connection to the victim, no history of violence against mine personnel. The investigation went nowhere. The case went cold, and Thomas Garrett was buried in the Redemption Creek Cemetery with half the town in attendance, crying for a good man taken too soon, while Jackson stood in the back of the crowd, still a prisoner in his own skin, still unable to confess or explain or do anything but watch the consequences of a contract he'd signed for money that now felt like chains forged in hell. Silas returned that night with Jackson's payment and a message from the consortium. They were pleased with his work, impressed by the results, ready to move forward with additional contracts that would require similar services. Jackson tried to refuse again, tried to explain that being forced to commit murder while conscious but unable to resist was a torture worse than any physical punishment. But Silas just smiled and reminded Jackson that he'd sold his fate, sold his future, sold his ability to be anything other than what they required, and the only way out of the contract was death, his own death, which might not even free him, depending on what the consortium had planned for his soul. Over the next 6 months, Jackson became the ghost of Redemption Creek, the mysterious force behind a campaign of terror that destroyed the silver mine's reputation and broke the owner's will to continue. And he did it all while trapped inside himself, watching his hands commit sabotage and arson and murder, watching his mouth lie and deceive and manipulate, watching himself become exactly the kind of monster he'd once despised. The mine owners finally sold to Silas's consortium for a fraction of what it was worth, and the investors made millions while Jackson collected his payments and deposited them in banks where the money piled up like evidence of his damnation, useless to him now because he couldn't spend it on anything that would give him peace or redemption or freedom from the contract that owned him. Let me know in the comments if you think Jackson deserved what happened to him, if making a deal with devils, metaphorical or literal, is ever justified by circumstances, because we're about to see how Jackson's story gets even darker when he discovers the full scope of what he'd signed away and what the consortium really wanted from a man who no longer owned his own fate. The consortium's next assignment sent Jackson to a town called Bitter Springs, 300 miles south of Redemption Creek, where a railroad company was trying to build a line through land controlled by a coalition of ranchers who refused to sell their property for any price. Jackson's job was to break that coalition by any means necessary, to turn the ranchers against each other through manufactured conflicts and staged attacks, to create enough chaos and suspicion that they'd abandon their united front and sell their land individually for whatever they could get. It was psychological warfare dressed up as frontier justice, and Jackson was the weapon whether he wanted to be or not, still trapped in his own body, still conscious of every terrible thing he did while unable to stop any of it. He started by rustling cattle from one ranch and planting evidence pointing to a neighboring rancher, then did it again in reverse, then escalated to burning barns and poisoning water supplies and leaving false clues that turned neighbors into enemies. The ranchers, who'd been friends and allies for decades, began to suspect each other of betrayal, began hiring guns to protect their property from each other, began feuding in ways that made cooperation impossible, and selling to the railroad company looked like the only way to end the violence. Jackson orchestrated it all with precision that would have impressed military strategists, and he hated every second of it, hated watching good people destroy each other over lies he'd planted, hated the efficiency with which his puppet body executed strategies his imprisoned mind could see but not prevent. But the worst was yet to come. Because one of the ranchers, a man named William McCrae, was too smart and too stubborn to fall for the manufactured conflicts, and he started investigating, started connecting dots, started following trails that led back to Jackson's hotel room in Bitter Springs. William McCrae showed up one evening with evidence and questions, demanding to know who Jackson really was and who he was working for, and Jackson felt hope flare in his chest because maybe this was his chance. Maybe he could communicate what was happening to him. Maybe William McCrae could help him find a way out of the contract that had turned him into a flesh puppet for evil men. He tried to speak, tried to confess, tried to scream the truth with every ounce of will he possessed, but his mouth said different words, smooth lies about being a railroad surveyor, nothing suspicious, just doing preliminary work, and his hand moved to his Colt with the deadly speed he'd developed over years of practice. He watched from inside his own eyes as his body drew and fired, as William McCrae fell with a bullet through his throat, as blood drowned in his own blood, while trying to speak, while reaching out with hands that begged for help Jackson couldn't give. Jackson's body holstered the revolver, cleaned up the evidence, moved the body to make it look like McCrae had been killed somewhere else, and arranged the scene so perfectly that no investigation would ever connect Jackson to the crime. And all the while, Jackson's consciousness screamed and wept and tried to claw its way out of the prison of his own flesh. This became Jackson's existence for the next 3 years, being sent from territory to territory, from crisis to crisis, wherever the consortium needed someone to do terrible things for profit. And Jackson did them all while trapped behind his own eyes, an audience to atrocities he committed but didn't choose. He broke unions by killing their leaders. He started range wars between cattlemen and sheep herders. He assassinated politicians who opposed the consortium's business interests. He burned down newspapers that published investigative stories about the consortium's activities, and with each assignment he collected payment he couldn't spend, and guilt he couldn't escape, and memories that poisoned every moment of consciousness he had left.
The consortium's control was so complete that Jackson couldn't even kill himself, couldn't turn his own gun on himself or jump off a cliff or do anything that might end his suffering and stop his hands from committing more evil, because the contract specified that his body had to remain functional and alive until the consortium decided otherwise, until they'd extracted every ounce of use from the fate he'd sold them. He tried anyway, dozens of times. Tried to throw himself in front of trains or leap into rivers or poison his own food, but his body always rebelled at the last second, always pulled back from the brink, always kept him alive and functional and available for whatever horror the consortium required next. During this time, Jackson learned more about what he'd actually signed, learned that the consortium wasn't just a group of wealthy investors, but something older and stranger. An organization that had existed in various forms for centuries, always acquiring power through contracts with desperate people, always offering what you wanted most in exchange for what you should never give up. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a representative, but a harvester, someone who identified potential contracts and sealed deals that fed some larger purpose Jackson couldn't fully understand, but suspected was connected to forces that existed outside normal reality, forces that fed on human suffering and corruption, that grew stronger every time someone like Jackson chose short-term gain over long-term integrity. Now here's where Jackson's story takes a turn, because after 3 years of being a puppet, something started to change. Something in the fundamental nature of the contract or the consortium's control, or maybe in Jackson's own consciousness, and he began to feel moments of agency returning, brief seconds where he could move his own finger or speak his own word or resist an impulse that came from the puppet masters pulling his strings. These moments were rare and unpredictable, flashes of freedom in an ocean of slavery, but they gave Jackson something he hadn't had in years: hope. Terrible and dangerous hope that maybe the contract wasn't as absolute as Silas claimed, maybe there were cracks in the chains, maybe Jackson could find a way to reclaim his fate from the devils he'd sold it to. If you're still with me on this journey into the darkest corners of Western revenge and supernatural justice, smash that like button and drop a comment about whether you think redemption is possible for someone who's committed atrocities even under supernatural compulsion. Because what Jackson does with these moments of freedom will determine whether his story ends in tragedy or something else entirely.
The first time Jackson managed to resist the consortium's control for more than a few seconds was during an assignment in Santa Fe, where he was supposed to murder a judge who'd been ruling against the consortium's mining interests. And as his hand reached for his Colt, Jackson managed to stop, managed to freeze his own motion, managed to walk away from the target and back to his hotel room where he collapsed shaking and sweating from the effort of wresting control from forces that had owned him for 3 years. The freedom lasted maybe 10 minutes before the consortium's power reasserted itself and he found himself walking back toward the judge's house like nothing had happened. But those 10 minutes proved something crucial. The contract could be fought, the chains could be resisted, the fate he'd sold could maybe be bought back with enough will and suffering. Jackson began experimenting with resistance, testing the limits of the consortium's control, finding that he could sometimes delay actions or slightly modify how he carried them out, even if he couldn't stop them entirely. He discovered that the control was strongest when he tried to directly defy orders, but weaker when he worked around the edges, adding small acts of mercy or warning to the terrible things he was forced to do. When ordered to burn down a boarding house full of workers who were organizing a strike, Jackson couldn't stop himself from setting the fire, but he managed to trigger the town's fire bell first, managed to give the residents warning they wouldn't have otherwise, managed to save most of their lives even though he still had to destroy their home and possessions. These small rebellions became Jackson's way of maintaining some thread of his own humanity, of proving to himself that he still existed as something more than a meat puppet dancing for evil masters, but they also attracted the consortium's attention because the results weren't quite as clean and complete as they'd been before. Silas Blackwood appeared in Jackson's room one night, not angry but curious, intrigued by the resistance he could sense in Jackson's actions, and he explained something that made Jackson's blood run cold. The consortium didn't actually want perfect obedience. They wanted struggle, wanted the psychological torture of being conscious while committing evil, wanted the corruption of watching yourself become a monster despite your best intentions, because that suffering and corruption fed something in them, nourished some dark purpose that required not just evil acts, but the destruction of the good people who committed those acts. This revelation should have broken Jackson completely. Should have shown him that even his resistance was part of the trap, part of what they wanted from him. But instead, it gave him clarity. Because if the consortium fed on his suffering and corruption, then maybe the way to hurt them was to stop suffering, stop letting them corrupt him, reclaim his own narrative about who he was and what he'd become. It sounds absurd. The idea that you can choose not to suffer when supernatural forces are puppeting your body through murder and mayhem, but Jackson realized that suffering was a choice in some fundamental way, that he could acknowledge what he'd done without letting it define who he was, that he could carry guilt without drowning in it, that he could look for redemption even while bound by a contract that seemed to make redemption impossible. He started keeping a journal, writing down every assignment, every victim, every terrible thing he'd been forced to do, not as confession, but as testimony, as evidence of what the consortium was and what they did to people desperate enough to sign contracts they didn't understand. He couldn't break the consortium's physical control over his body, but he could document their existence, could create a record that might survive him and warn others, could transform his suffering into information that might prevent future victims from making the same mistake he'd made in that saloon in Redemption Creek. The journal became his anchor, the thing that reminded him he was still Jackson Mercer underneath the puppet strings, still capable of choice, even if most of his choices were impossible to act on.
His next act of resistance was more dramatic. During an assignment to assassinate a crusading newspaper editor in Denver who'd been publishing exposés about corruption in territorial government, Jackson managed to grab control for almost an hour, long enough to visit the editor's office and leave a cryptic warning about the consortium, about what they were and how they operated, about contracts that stole more than money. The editor didn't understand, thought Jackson was a madman or a drunk, but Jackson planted seeds of information that might grow into something useful, might help someone else connect dots that would reveal the consortium's operations. The consortium's control snapped back before Jackson could explain more, and his body completed the assassination as ordered. But the warning had been given. The information was out in the world, and Jackson felt something close to triumph, even as his hands committed murder. This became Jackson's pattern for the next year,
completing assignments as the consortium required, but finding moments to resist, to warn, to document, to undermine the very evil he was forced to commit. And with each small victory, he felt himself growing stronger, felt the consortium's control becoming slightly less absolute, felt like maybe there was a path to freedom that didn't require his death or the death of everyone he'd ever cared about. He learned that the contract wasn't just supernatural but psychological, that it drew power from his own belief in its absoluteness, his own acceptance that he was helpless, his own despair at being irredeemable. And by refusing to accept those beliefs, he weakened the chains, even though he couldn't yet break them entirely. But the consortium noticed his growing resistance and decided to test him in a way that would either break him completely or bind him to them forever. They assigned him to return to Redemption Creek, to the town where his corruption had begun, and to complete unfinished business that would destroy whatever remained of his soul or prove that he'd finally found a way to beat them at their own twisted game. Drop a comment below about what you think Jackson should do when he returns to Redemption Creek, whether redemption is possible for someone who's committed the acts he has, whether fighting evil from within makes you complicit or courageous, because we're about to see Jackson face his past and his future simultaneously in a confrontation that will determine not just his fate, but the fates of everyone connected to the contracts he signed and the evil he's been forced to serve. Jackson arrived in Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 7 years after he'd left it as a puppet for the consortium, and the town had changed in ways that reflected the damage he'd helped inflict. The silver mine had closed down completely after the consortium extracted everything valuable and abandoned the operation, leaving hundreds of people without work, without prospects, without the industry that had built the town and sustained it. The main street was half empty, with businesses boarded up and dust gathering in doorways where prosperity used to flow. And the people who remained had the hollow-eyed look of folks who'd been betrayed by promises that seemed solid but turned out to be smoke. Jackson's assignment was specific and cruel. The consortium wanted him to finish what he'd started, to destroy the last remnants of resistance to their complete control of the territory's mining rights, and that meant eliminating a group of former miners who were organizing legal action against the consortium, claiming they'd been defrauded and poisoned by mining practices that prioritized profit over safety. The group's leader was a man named Daniel Garrett, Thomas Garrett's older brother, who'd taken up his brother's cause after Thomas's unsolved murder, who'd spent years gathering evidence of the consortium's crimes, who was close to filing a lawsuit that might actually expose what the consortium was and how they operated. The terrible poetry of the assignment wasn't lost on Jackson. He'd been forced to murder Thomas Garrett to help the consortium acquire the mine, and now he was being forced to murder his brother to help the consortium escape consequences for what they'd done with it. And somewhere in the dark hierarchy, someone must have thought this was appropriate, must have designed this assignment specifically to show Jackson that resistance was futile, that no matter how much he fought, he'd always end up serving their purposes, always end up destroying the good and enabling the evil. But Jackson had learned things during his years of resistance, had learned that the consortium's power was absolute within certain parameters, but had limitations they didn't like to acknowledge, had learned that moments of true moral crisis created cracks in their control, because those moments connected to something deeper than psychological manipulation or supernatural enforcement, connected to whatever makes humans human instead of just meat machines following programming. He felt that crack opening as he walked toward Daniel Garrett's office, felt the consortium pushing him to complete the assignment quickly and efficiently, felt his hand reaching for his Colt with the deadly certainty of 7 years of forced practice. And Jackson stopped walking, just stopped in the middle of the dusty street, and the effort of stopping felt like holding up a mountain, felt like every muscle in his body was tearing itself apart, but he held position, refused to take another step toward Daniel Garrett's office, refused to murder another good man for evil purposes, no matter what pain the refusal caused him. The consortium's power pushed harder, sent waves of agony through Jackson's nervous system that would have made most men beg for death. But Jackson had been living in a prison of his own body for 7 years, and pain was just another familiar companion, something he could acknowledge without letting it control him. He stood there in the street for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, locked in a battle of wills with forces that existed outside normal reality. And people started to notice, started gathering to watch this stranger standing frozen like a statue, started murmuring questions about what was wrong with him, started approaching to ask if he needed help. And that's when Jackson found his voice, found he could speak despite the consortium screaming in his head to be silent, found he could choose his words, even though the words came out strained and broken and barely comprehensible to the people around him. "Get Daniel Garrett," Jackson managed to say through clenched teeth. "Need to warn him, need to confess, need to stop this before more people die." And the crowd didn't understand, but they knew desperation when they heard it, knew the sound of a man fighting for his soul. And someone ran to fetch Daniel Garrett, while Jackson stood there shaking and sweating and bleeding from his nose with the effort of maintaining control over his own voice and position. The consortium's power was pushing so hard that Jackson could feel something in his brain starting to rupture, could feel blood vessels bursting and muscles tearing, could feel his body trying to kill itself rather than continue resisting orders that had been enforced without question for 7 years. Daniel Garrett arrived, suspicious and cautious, because he'd learned to be careful after his brother's death, after years of threats from anonymous sources, after discovering that the consortium had reach and resources beyond what any normal business should possess. He looked at Jackson and saw a stranger in obvious distress, and his first instinct was compassion despite his caution, was to step forward and ask what was wrong, how he could help, whether Jackson needed a doctor or law enforcement, or just a hand to steady himself. "I murdered your brother," Jackson forced out, words like knives cutting his throat from inside. "Was sent by the consortium, been their puppet for 7 years. Came here to kill you too, but I'm done being their weapon, done watching myself destroy good people. And you need to know what they are and how they work before they send someone else, or before my body breaks free and finishes what they sent me to do." Daniel Garrett stepped back, hand going to a revolver at his hip, confusion and anger warring on his face, because this stranger had just confessed to murdering Thomas, but also seemed to be warning him, seemed to be fighting some invisible force that was making his body convulse and shake like he was being torn apart from the inside. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama, sensing violence about to erupt, and Jackson could feel the consortium's power surging again, could feel his own hand moving toward his Colt despite every ounce of will he possessed screaming at it to stop, could feel the puppet strings pulling tighter as the consortium realized their weapon was malfunctioning in ways they couldn't tolerate. "Daniel, don't let me kill you," Jackson gasped, his hand now gripping his revolver, drawing it from the holster with mechanical precision that his conscious mind screamed against. "Shoot me if you have to, but listen first. The consortium uses contracts to control people. Supernatural contracts that steal your fate, your agency, your ability to choose anything other than serving them. And they're everywhere, in every territory, corrupting everything they touch, turning desperate people into weapons against their own communities." His revolver was out now, rising toward Daniel Garrett with the steady aim of someone who'd killed dozens of people over 7 years. And Jackson felt tears streaming down his face because he'd been so close, had almost broken free, had almost done one good thing after 7 years of forced evil. But the consortium's power was too strong, too deeply woven into the contract he'd signed, too absolute in its claim on his physical form. Daniel Garrett was drawing his own weapon now, a Remington that looked well-maintained and recently fired, the gun of a man who'd learned to be ready for violence. And Jackson wanted to shout at him to shoot faster, to end this before Jackson's body completed the assignment and murdered another member of the Garrett family. But something else happened, something Jackson didn't expect, and probably the consortium didn't either, because a woman stepped between them, moved faster than thought, put herself directly in the line of fire with arms spread wide like she could stop bullets with compassion. She was maybe 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and hands that showed hard work, wearing a simple dress that had been mended more than once. And her eyes held something Jackson hadn't seen directed at him in 7 years, not fear or hatred, but recognition, like she could see the man trapped inside the puppet and refused to accept that the puppet was all there was. "My name is Sarah Mackenzie," she said to Jackson, not to the crowd or to Daniel Garrett, but specifically to Jackson, like she was speaking to him and him alone. "And I watched you stand in this street and fight yourself for 10 minutes before Daniel got here. Watched you bleed from your nose and ears with the effort of resisting something the rest of us can't see. And I don't know if you're crazy or cursed or both, but I know you're trying to do something right even while something's forcing you to do something wrong." Jackson's hand was shaking now, the revolver wavering between Sarah Mackenzie and Daniel Garrett, and the consortium's power was screaming at him to fire, to complete the assignment, to eliminate the target and the witness and anyone else who stood between Jackson and the consortium's requirements. But Sarah Mackenzie wasn't moving, wasn't showing fear, was just standing there looking at Jackson with eyes that seemed to see straight through to the man he'd been before Redemption Creek, before Silas Blackwood, before the contract that had turned him into a monster wearing human skin.
"You can fight it," Sarah Mackenzie said with absolute certainty. "I don't know how I know, but I know whatever's controlling you isn't stronger than the part of you that stood in this street and warned us, isn't stronger than the part that's crying while it tries to murder good people, isn't stronger than the soul you've been protecting even while your body committed atrocities." And something in Jackson broke, or maybe something finally healed, because her words touched something the consortium couldn't reach, some core of identity that existed deeper than contracts or supernatural control or 7 years of conditioning. And he felt the puppet strings snap, felt control return fully to his body for the first time since that terrible day when he'd murdered Thomas Garrett while screaming inside his own head. His hand lowered the revolver. His finger came off the trigger, and he dropped the weapon in the dust like it had burned him. And the relief was so profound that he collapsed to his knees, gasping and sobbing with the shock of being fully himself again. The crowd murmured and shifted, unsure what they'd just witnessed. And Daniel Garrett kept his own weapon trained on Jackson because a confession of murder doesn't become irrelevant just because the murderer seems to have had a breakdown. But Sarah Mackenzie knelt beside Jackson, put a hand on his shaking shoulder, and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "You're not done yet. Breaking free is only the first step. Now you have to make sure they can't put the strings back on, and you have to warn everyone who might be vulnerable to the same trap." Jackson looked up through tears and blood and 7 years of accumulated horror, and he managed to nod, managed to find words that were his own for the first time in so long. "I kept records, documented everything, every assignment, every victim, every method they used to identify and corrupt people, hidden in a bank deposit box in Denver under a false name. And I can testify, can tell authorities everything I know, even if it means hanging for what I've done."
"Before you start confessing to hangable offenses," a new voice cut in, "maybe you should tell us who exactly we're dealing with." And Jackson looked up to see an older man pushing through the crowd, wearing a marshal's badge that looked tarnished but authentic, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen most of what humanity had to offer and wasn't impressed by much of it anymore. His name was Marshal Thomas Wade, and he'd been tracking unusual patterns of violence and sabotage across 3 territories for the past 5 years. Patterns that seemed coordinated but had no obvious source. Patterns that consistently benefited the same shadowy consortium of investors who always seemed to profit when communities collapsed and desperate people sold out for pennies on the dollar. If you're enjoying this tale of supernatural justice and hard-won redemption, hit that subscribe button, because we're entering the final act, where Jackson's testimony and Sarah Mackenzie's inexplicable faith and Marshal Wade's investigation collide to reveal truths about the consortium that nobody expected. Truths that will change how everyone understands power and corruption and the price of making deals with devils wearing human faces. Marshal Wade ordered the crowd to disperse, told Daniel Garrett to lower his weapon, and helped Jackson to his feet with surprising gentleness for a man who just heard a confession of murder. They relocated to the marshal's temporary office in what used to be the assay building before the mine closed, and Wade poured 3 glasses of whiskey while Sarah Mackenzie invited herself to the meeting over Wade's half-hearted objections, claiming that someone who just prevented a murder had earned the right to hear the story behind it. Daniel Garrett came too, revolver still in hand, still processing the fact that the man who'd murdered his brother was sitting across from him, claiming supernatural compulsion as a defense. Jackson talked for 6 straight hours, starting with his childhood poverty, moving through his early criminal career, explaining the meeting with Silas Blackwood and the contract he'd signed without fully understanding, describing 7 years of being a puppet for the consortium's purposes, detailing every assignment he could remember and every victim he'd been forced to create. He described the moments of returning agency, the journal he'd kept, the small acts of resistance that had led him to this moment of potential freedom. He gave Marshal Wade names, locations, patterns of behavior that might help identify other consortium operatives, methods they used to identify and recruit potential contractors who were desperate or ambitious enough to sign away their fates. Marshal Wade listened without interrupting, taking notes in neat handwriting that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. And when Jackson finally finished, when his voice was raw and his memories were emptied onto the table between them, Wade leaned back and sighed with the weight of someone who just had his worst suspicions confirmed. "I've been investigating similar patterns for 5 years," Wade said, "and I've found 17 other cases like yours, people who committed crimes that seemed out of character, who showed signs of coercion but claimed they acted of their own free will, who spoke in their sleep about contracts and puppet strings and forces they couldn't resist. Most of them are dead now, killed themselves or died in custody under suspicious circumstances, but 3 are still alive in various territorial prisons claiming they're innocent even though the evidence against them is overwhelming."
Sarah Mackenzie spoke up then, asking the question that Jackson had been dreading. If the consortium can control people through contracts, why did Jackson break free? What changed that made resistance possible after 7 years of absolute control? Jackson didn't have a good answer, could only say that something about Sarah's intervention had reached him in a way the consortium's power couldn't block, that her faith in his ability to fight had somehow strengthened his own faith, that maybe the consortium's control required the victim's despair to maintain its hold, and Sarah's compassion had shattered that despair completely. But Wade had a different theory, darker and more calculated, and he pulled out a folder filled with papers that represented 5 years of investigation into the consortium's activities. "According to what I've learned," Wade explained, "the consortium doesn't actually want perfect control.
They want suffering, want the psychological torture of watching yourself commit evil, want to corrupt good people into monsters, because that corruption feeds something in them, nourishes their power or their purpose, or whatever drives them to do this to people. So, when Jackson started resisting effectively, when he started finding ways to undermine their purposes, even while completing his assignments, he became less useful to them, less capable of producing the kind of suffering and corruption they actually feed on. Daniel Garrett interrupted, voice tight with grief and rage that had been building for 7 years since his brother's death. I don't care about theories or supernatural explanations or whether this man was controlled or not. He murdered Thomas, murdered a good man who never hurt anyone, and he needs to hang for that regardless of what was pulling his strings. Jackson nodded, expecting this, accepting it, because guilt is guilt regardless of compulsion, because he'd still pulled the trigger even if something else had commanded his finger. Because the dead stay dead, no matter how good your excuses are for killing them. But Sarah Mackenzie surprised everyone by standing up and putting herself between Jackson and Daniel Garrett again, repeating the pattern from the street, but now with words instead of just physical presence. If we hang him, we lose the only witness who can expose the consortium, she said firmly. We lose the evidence he's gathered, the testimony he can provide, the patterns he can identify that might save other people from signing the same kind of contracts. And more than that, we lose the proof that breaking free is possible, that the consortium's control isn't absolute, that resistance can succeed if you're willing to suffer for it. Daniel Garrett wasn't convinced, argued that justice for Thomas required Jackson's death, that the law demanded punishment for murder regardless of mitigating circumstances, that letting Jackson live would be betraying everything Thomas had stood for. Marshall Wade listened to both sides, then made a decision that reflected years of seeing frontier justice from both sides of a badge. He arrested Jackson formally for the murder of Thomas Garrett, placed him in custody pending trial, but also deputized him temporarily as a special witness in the investigation of the consortium, which meant Jackson would be protected from suspicious deaths or convenient accidents until he could testify about everything he knew. This wasn't redemption, Wade explained to Jackson as he locked the cell door, wasn't forgiveness or absolution or a clean slate. This was just postponing consequences long enough to do some good with the evil you've seen and been forced to commit, and after that, you'll face whatever punishment a judge and jury decide you deserve. Jackson accepted these terms because they were more than he deserved, more than he'd hoped for when he'd walked into Redemption Creek expecting to either break free or die trying. And he spent the next 3 days in a cell writing down everything he could remember about the consortium while Sarah Mackenzie brought him meals and asked questions that helped him remember details he'd forgotten. On the 4th day, Silas Blackwood appeared in Jackson's cell, just appeared without opening doors or windows, materializing like smoke gaining substance, and his strange eyes held something Jackson had never seen in them before, genuine surprise mixed with calculation and grudging respect. "You broke your contract," Silas said, wonderingly. "Actually broke it instead of just bending it at the edges. And I didn't think that was possible. Didn't think anyone had the strength to resist once we'd woven the strings deeply enough." Jackson didn't respond, just watched Silas the way he'd watched dangerous animals before shooting them. And Silas smiled like Jackson's silence was revealing more than words would. "The consortium is very interested in how you did it," Silas continued. "Interested enough to offer you a new contract, one that gives you freedom and resources in exchange for your expertise about resistance, about how to identify and prevent other contractors from breaking free the way you did.
It was a seductive offer, another devil's bargain dressed up as opportunity, and Jackson felt the old hunger stirring, the ambition that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. But 7 years of forced servitude had taught him something about the true price of seemingly advantageous deals. "Tell the consortium to go to hell," Jackson said quietly, "and tell them I'm coming for them, me and everyone I can convince to resist. Everyone who's been trapped by contracts they signed in desperation or ambition or ignorance, and we're going to burn their operations down, even if it takes the rest of our lives." Silas looked genuinely surprised again, then laughed, a sound without humor or warmth, and explained that Jackson had misunderstood his position. The contract might be broken, but that didn't make Jackson free, didn't erase the debts he owed or the marks the consortium had left on his soul, didn't change the fact that Jackson belonged to them in ways that transcended legal or physical control.
And then Silas did something that revealed more about the consortium's nature than 7 years of servitude had. He showed Jackson what the consortium really was, let the human mask slip enough for Jackson to see the truth underneath. It wasn't pretty, wasn't comprehensible in normal terms, was something that existed in angles that hurt to perceive and colors that didn't have names, something that had been old when humanity was young and would be feeding on human suffering long after the last person died. The consortium wasn't a business or even an organization. It was an entity, possibly multiple entities working in coordination, something that existed partially in the physical world but mostly in spaces adjacent to reality, spaces where concepts like mercy and justice and redemption didn't apply because they'd never been invented. The vision lasted maybe 3 seconds before Jackson's mind couldn't process anymore and shut down in self-defense. But those 3 seconds taught him that he'd been fighting something far worse than corrupt businessmen or even supernatural slavers. He'd been fighting something that viewed humanity the way humans view cattle, as resources to be exploited for purposes humans couldn't understand and wouldn't survive understanding. When he came back to himself, Silas was gone, and Sarah Mackenzie was shaking him awake, worried because she'd heard him screaming from outside the jail. And Jackson tried to explain what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come, couldn't be forced into human language without losing essential truth. The overnight 2 weeks, Marshal Wade used Jackson's testimony to coordinate raids on known consortium operations across 3 territories, arresting operatives and seizing documents that revealed the scope of what they were fighting. Dozens of contracts, hundreds of victims, thousands of crimes committed by people who thought they were acting of their own free will, but were actually puppets for an entity that fed on human suffering and corruption. But every arrest led to mysterious deaths in custody. Every seized document somehow caught fire or disappeared. Every piece of evidence evaporated like morning dew under sun. And Wade realized they were fighting an enemy that had resources and reach beyond what any normal law enforcement operation could counter. Jackson worked from his cell, interviewing the 3 surviving contractors Wade had identified, helping them understand what had been done to them and how they might resist, teaching them techniques he'd developed for bending the consortium's control, even if they couldn't break it entirely. 2 of the 3 couldn't or wouldn't try, had been puppets for so long that they'd stopped believing in their own agency, had internalized the consortium's control until it became indistinguishable from their own will. But the 3rd, a woman named Margaret Chen, who'd been forced to commit industrial sabotage for 6 years, managed to grab moments of control using Jackson's methods, managed to resist long enough to provide testimony about assignments she'd completed and operatives she'd worked with. Sarah Mackenzie proved unexpectedly valuable, not as an investigator, but as an anchor, someone whose presence seemed to weaken the consortium's supernatural influence in ways nobody understood, but everyone could observe. When she visited Jackson in his cell, he felt clearer, more himself, more able to remember details without the fog that usually obscured his memories of consortium operations.
When she accompanied Marshall Wade on interviews with victims, those victims found it easier to resist their conditioning, easier to speak truths they've been compelled to hide. Nobody knew why Sarah had this effect, least of all Sarah herself, but Wade started bringing her to every important meeting and making sure she was present during every critical testimony. Daniel Garrett remained unconvinced, refused to accept that Jackson deserved anything less than hanging, but he threw himself into investigating the consortium with the same passionate intensity he'd brought to honoring his brother's memory. Using his knowledge of mining operations to identify patterns of sabotage and fraud that Jackson's testimony had described. He discovered that the consortium had been operating in the territories for at least 50 years, that there were records going back to the 1820s of similar patterns of violence and corruption following their operations, that dozens of communities had been destroyed the way Redemption Creek had been destroyed, bled dry and abandoned once the consortium had extracted everything of value. The trial for Thomas Garrett's murder was scheduled for 6 weeks after Jackson's arrest, and public opinion in Redemption Creek was divided between those who wanted Jackson hanged immediately and those who thought his cooperation with the investigation merited consideration. Jackson himself didn't participate in the debate, spent his time documenting everything he could about the consortium and trying to identify other potential contractors who might be suffering under compulsion they couldn't name. He wrote letters to territorial governors and federal marshals explaining what he'd learned about the consortium and warning about the danger they represented. The most of his letters went unanswered or produced responses that suggested the consortium had influence even at those levels of government.
But Daniel Garrett surprised everyone by speaking in favor of accepting the terms, not because he'd forgiven Jackson, but because he'd lost too much to the consortium already and couldn't bear the thought of other families suffering the way his had suffered. If accepting the terms stops them from creating more victims, Daniel argued, then isn't that worth Jackson's silence, worth letting him avoid punishment if it buys safety for others? It was practical, utilitarian reasoning that made perfect sense if you ignored what it meant for Jackson's soul and the souls of everyone the consortium would victimize in whatever territories they withdrew to. Jackson listened to the debate, watched people who'd become allies argue about whether he should sacrifice himself again for the greater good, and realized that the consortium had designed this choice perfectly, had crafted it to produce maximum psychological suffering regardless of what Jackson decided. If he accepted the terms, he'd be complicit in future suffering and bound to silence about evil he'd witnessed. But if he refused, he'd be responsible for the continued suffering of contractors across the territories who could have been freed. It was a trap that used Jackson's newfound conscience against him, that weaponized his desire for redemption by making redemption impossible regardless of what choice he made. And that's when Jackson understood something crucial about the consortium's nature and operations. They didn't just feed on suffering and corruption, they fed on impossible moral choices, on situations where every option produced guilt and trauma, on the psychological torture of watching yourself cause harm regardless of your intentions. The contract he'd signed 7 years ago wasn't the trap, it was just the mechanism of the trap. The real trap was the corruption of his moral sense, the destruction of his ability to believe in his own goodness, the conversion of a desperate man into someone who believed he deserved damnation and would work to fulfill that belief through choices that made redemption impossible. Make sure you're subscribed because what Jackson does next will determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone caught in the consortium's web. And it's going to involve a confrontation that challenges everything we've assumed about power and justice and the possibility of fighting evil that exists beyond human comprehension. Jackson stood up in the middle of the debate and spoke with clarity that had been building since Sarah Mackenzie first stepped between him and his target, since she'd proven that faith in human goodness could be stronger than supernatural compulsion.
"I'm not accepting your terms," he told Silas Blackwood, "not because I don't care about the other contractors, not because I want them to suffer, but because your offer is designed to perpetuate exactly the kind of moral corruption you feed on. Designed to make me complicit in suffering I can't see, so I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I made the right choice." Silas's face showed genuine surprise again, and his two companions shifted in ways that suggested they were recalculating, adjusting predictions that had been based on assumptions about Jackson's psychology and moral framework. "You're choosing to let hundreds of people continue suffering under compulsion," Silas pointed out, "choosing your moral purity over their practical freedom, and how is that different from the selfish choices you made 7 years ago when you signed your original contract?" It was a good argument, the kind of argument that should have made Jackson doubt his choice, but Jackson had learned something during 7 years of forced servitude and 3 weeks of reclaimed agency. "The difference," Jackson explained, "is that 7 years ago I was trying to escape consequences and grab advantages without considering costs, and now I'm accepting consequences and refusing advantages specifically because I've learned to consider costs, learned that some prices are too high, even when refusing to pay them means suffering." You feed on moral corruption, on watching good people become monsters, on the psychological torture of consciousness without agency, but I'm done being your food, done letting you use my choices to hurt people regardless of what I decide. He turned to Marshall Wade and said something that had been building since the moment he'd broken free from the consortium's control. The way to fight them isn't through law enforcement or legal procedures, isn't through arrests and trials and conventional justice, because they exist partially outside the systems those procedures were designed for. The way to fight them is through exposure, through telling everyone who listen what they are and how they operate, through building communities of resistance where people protect each other from predatory offers and supernatural compulsion. Sarah Mackenzie nodded like this confirmed something she'd suspected and added her own insight that came from intuition rather than analysis. "They're weaker when people know they exist," she said, "weaker when communities are connected and watching out for each other, weaker when people refuse to be isolated and desperate because isolation and desperation are what makes someone vulnerable to their offers in the first place. The consortium feeds on disconnection, on the belief that you have to face your problems alone, on the idea that your circumstances are unique and nobody else would understand. And the antidote is exactly the opposite, is telling your story and hearing other stories and realizing you're part of something larger than your individual suffering." Silas's human mask slipped slightly, showing something underneath that hurt to look at, something that confirmed everything Jackson and Sarah had theorized about the consortium's nature and vulnerabilities. "You've learned too much," Silas said, with what might have been anger or might have been fear in something that didn't quite understand either emotion. "Learn things that make you dangerous in ways we didn't anticipate, and we can't allow you to continue spreading information that might immunize others against our methods." It was as close to a threat as the consortium had made directly, and Marshall Wade responded by drawing his revolver and placing himself between Silas and Jackson, which would have been brave if guns had any effect on beings that existed partially outside physical reality.
But something unexpected happened. The two consortium representatives with Silas flinched away from Wade's weapon, moved as if the revolver represented an actual threat, and Jackson realized that while guns couldn't kill consortium entities, they might be able to hurt or banish them, might represent concentrated human will and intention in a form that could affect things existing in spaces adjacent to normal reality. Wade noticed the reaction too and kept his weapon trained on Silas while backing toward the door, ordering everyone else to follow. And the consortium representatives didn't pursue, just watched with calculating eyes as the humans retreated from an office that had been infiltrated without anyone noticing. They regrouped in the jail where Jackson had been held, fortifying it with whatever materials they could find, iron and salt and other traditional protections that nobody really believed would work, but that made everyone feel slightly safer. Jackson explained what he'd observed during his 7 years of servitude, that the consortium seemed bound by certain rules they couldn't violate directly, that they required consent through contracts to establish control, that breaking a contract seemed to weaken their overall power in ways that suggested their strength was tied to maintaining the illusion of absolute authority over their contractors. It was fragmentary information, the kind of knowledge you gather from observation rather than explanation, but it was more than anyone else had managed to learn about the consortium's vulnerabilities. Daniel Garrett contributed information about Thomas, about how his brother had been researching similar patterns of violence and corruption before his death, about journals Thomas had kept that Daniel still had hidden in his home. They retrieved the journals and found that Thomas had been close to the same conclusions Jackson had reached, had theorized that the consortium was something supernatural or extra-dimensional that fed on human suffering, had even identified several potential contractors who were acting strangely in ways that suggested external compulsion. Thomas had been killed before he could act on his discoveries, but his research provided additional evidence and context that strengthened their understanding of what they were fighting. Over the next week, they worked to assemble a comprehensive case against the consortium, combining Jackson's testimony, Thomas's research, Wade's 5 years of investigation, and interviews with the 3 surviving contractors who were willing to speak. They sent copies of everything to newspapers, marshals, territorial governors, even congressmen in Washington, flooding the system with so much information that the consortium couldn't suppress it all, despite their obvious efforts. Some newspapers refused to publish, some marshals claimed the evidence was insufficient, some politicians dismissed the entire thing as conspiracy nonsense, but enough people paid attention, enough stories got printed, enough warnings got distributed that the consortium's ability to operate in shadows was significantly compromised. The trial for Thomas Garrett's murder became a public sensation, drawing attention from across the territories, with reporters and curiosity seekers filling Redemption Creek beyond its capacity to house them. Jackson's defense attorney, a young idealist named Benjamin Carter, who'd volunteered for the case despite its obvious impossibility, argued that Jackson had been under supernatural compulsion during the murder, that he couldn't be held fully responsible for actions he didn't choose, even if he physically committed them. The prosecution, led by a territorial attorney who'd made his reputation on high-profile convictions, countered that supernatural compulsion was not a recognized legal defense, that Jackson had signed the contract of his own free will, that nothing excused the act of putting a bullet through an innocent man's heart. The jury deliberated for 3 days, deadlocked between those who believed Jackson's testimony about the consortium and those who thought he was using an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid responsibility for murder, between those who saw him as a victim fighting back and those who saw him as a criminal trying to manipulate sympathy. Finally, they reached a compromised verdict that satisfied nobody, but reflected the complexity of judging someone who'd committed terrible acts under supernatural compulsion. They found Jackson guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging criminal responsibility while accepting that mitigating circumstances reduced his culpability, and they recommended leniency based on his cooperation with the investigation and his efforts to expose the consortium. The judge, a stern woman named Harriet Blackstone, who'd been presiding over territorial courts for 20 years, sentenced Jackson to 15 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5, and she used her sentencing statement to deliver a broader commentary about justice and accountability that got reprinted in newspapers across the country. Evil that hides behind contracts and legal technicalities is still evil, Judge Blackstone said, and good done under compulsion still requires courage, even if it doesn't erase guilt. And I hope this sentence reflects that human justice is an imperfect tool for measuring complex moral situations where supernatural forces exploit human weakness for inhuman purposes. Jackson accepted the sentence without complaint,
felt something like relief that consequences had finally arrived, that he'd been judged and found guilty and given a punishment that was finite and survivable rather than the infinite damnation he'd expected. But before the marshals could transport him to the territorial prison, before he could begin serving his sentence and trying to rebuild something resembling a life, Silas Blackwood appeared one final time, materializing in Jackson's cell with an offer that was simultaneously a warning and a revelation. You've cost us operational effectiveness in these territories, cost us decades of careful positioning and hundreds of contracts that are now vulnerable to resistance because you've provided a template for breaking free. And the consortium wants you to know that this isn't over, that we'll be watching you and everyone connected to you, that the debt you incurred by breaking your contract still exists in forms that transcend legal consequences or human justice. But Silas also revealed something that suggested the consortium's appearance of absolute power was covering significant anxiety. Something in how Jackson had broken free had surprised them, had revealed a vulnerability in their operations they believed was impossible, and they were genuinely concerned that other contractors might replicate his success and create cascading failures in systems they'd spent centuries constructing.
Hit that like button if you want to see how this story resolves, whether Jackson's sacrifice and resistance inspire others to break free, whether humanity can actually fight forces that exist beyond human comprehension, because we're approaching the conclusion where all the threads come together and Jackson faces the true cost of reclaiming his fate from devils who bought it for the price of ambition. Jackson was transported to the territorial prison in Santa Fe, a grim fortress built into red rocks that seemed to absorb hope like stone absorbs rain, where he'd spend the next 5 to 15 years paying society's price for what he'd done to Thomas Garrett and indirectly to dozens of other victims whose lives he destroyed while puppeted by the consortium. The prison was brutal in the way frontier prisons are brutal, overcrowded and understaffed, and full of men whose violence was kept barely contained by walls and guards and the threat of hanging. But Jackson found he could endure it because he'd already survived 7 years in a prison of his own flesh, and at least this prison was honest about being a prison. He was assigned to the quarry detail, breaking rocks under territorial sun, which gave him time to think about everything that had happened and everything he'd learned about the consortium and resistance and the price of reclaiming agency from forces designed to steal it. Other prisoners gave him space, sensing something in Jackson that marked him as dangerous, not because of violence, but because of intensity, because of eyes that had seen things normal criminals couldn't imagine, and a presence that suggested he was living in multiple realities simultaneously. The guards mostly ignored him because he never caused trouble, never fought, never tried to escape, just worked and thought and waited for whatever came next. Sarah Mackenzie visited monthly, traveling from Redemption Creek despite the distance and difficulty, bringing news about Marshall Wade's continued investigation and Daniel Garrett's efforts to support other contractors who were trying to resist the consortium's control. She told Jackson that the exposure he'd provided was having effects, that people across the territories were reporting suspicious contracts and warning their communities about offers that seemed too good to be true, that resistance networks were forming to provide support for anyone who felt they might be under supernatural compulsion. It wasn't perfect, wasn't enough to destroy the consortium entirely, but it was making their operations harder, making their methods less effective, creating antibodies in the social body that might eventually develop immunity to their predation. Daniel Garrett never visited, which Jackson understood and accepted, because forgiving someone for murdering your brother takes more than good intentions and supernatural excuses. It takes time and processing and maybe grace that exceeds human capacity.
But Daniel sent messages through Sarah, acknowledging that Jackson's testimony and resistance had helped identify patterns that led to exposing dozens of consortium operations, acknowledging that Thomas's death hadn't been meaningless because it had ultimately contributed to understanding and fighting the forces that killed him. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement, which was more than Jackson deserved and more than he'd expected. Marshal Wade visited once, 6 months into Jackson's sentence, looking older and more tired than he'd looked during the trial, and he brought news that was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. The consortium was retreating from direct operations in the territories, pulling back their obvious presence, but Wade had intelligence suggesting they were adapting rather than surrendering, developing new methods that were harder to identify and resist, methods that didn't rely on explicit contracts but on more subtle forms of manipulation and corruption. "The war isn't over," Wade told Jackson. "It's just moving into a new phase, and we're going to need people who understand the enemy if we want to keep fighting effectively." Jackson spent his nights in prison writing, documenting not just what he'd learned about the consortium, but what he'd learned about resistance, about the psychology of breaking free from control, about the communities and connections that made resistance possible in the first place. He wrote instruction manuals for identifying consortium influence, guides for supporting people under compulsion, theories about the consortium's nature and vulnerabilities based on everything he'd observed and experienced. The prison chaplain, a Methodist minister named Reverend Peters, who'd seen too much frontier violence to dismiss supernatural evil, helped Jackson smuggle the writings out of prison, getting them to newspapers and resistance networks and anyone who might benefit from Jackson's hard-won knowledge. 3 years into his sentence, Jackson received a letter from Margaret Chen, the contractor he'd helped break free before his trial, and she wrote about establishing a support network for former contractors, people who'd served the consortium and broken free and needed help rebuilding their lives and processing their trauma. She invited Jackson to correspond with network members, to provide guidance and encouragement based on his own experience, and Jackson threw himself into this work with an intensity that made the guards suspicious, but that ultimately seemed to make him less dangerous rather than more, because men fighting for redemption are usually too busy for petty prison violence. The resistance network grew, spreading through territories and even reaching back east, connecting people who'd been isolated in their suffering and helping them understand they weren't alone or crazy or permanently damned by choices they'd made under circumstances they didn't fully understand. Jackson became a central figure in this network despite being physically imprisoned, became someone whose story and strategies inspired others to resist, whose testimony provided language for experiences people couldn't previously describe, whose survival proved that breaking free was possible even when it seemed absolutely impossible. The consortium tried to suppress the network, tried to infiltrate and corrupt it, but the very nature of the network, its emphasis on transparency and mutual support and shared vulnerability, made it resistant to the kind of manipulation the consortium specialized in. 4 years into Jackson's sentence, something unprecedented happened that would change everything about how he understood the fight against the consortium and his own role in that fight. A prisoner arrived at Santa Fe who seemed ordinary at first, just another man convicted of crimes he claimed he didn't commit, just another voice in the chorus of denial and justification that filled every prison yard. But Jackson recognized something in this man's eyes, recognized the particular haunted quality of someone who'd been a puppet, who'd watched himself commit atrocities while screaming inside his own head, who'd only recently broken free and was now facing consequences for actions chosen by forces he couldn't name or explain to people who wouldn't believe him.
The man's name was Robert Ashford, and he'd been a consortium contractor for 9 years, forced to commit fraud and embezzlement and eventually murder while working as a banker in Kansas City, and he'd broken free using methods he learned from reading about Jackson's case, using resistance techniques Jackson had documented and smuggled out of prison through Reverend Peters. Robert had been convicted of embezzling $200,000 from his bank, money that had gone to the consortium's operations, and he was serving 20 years in the same prison where Jackson was serving his own sentence for crimes committed under similar compulsion. Jackson and Robert became allies immediately, recognizing in each other the specific trauma of consciousness without agency, of being forced to watch yourself destroy everything you valued while something else controlled your physical form. They shared stories, compared experiences, developed more refined theories about how the consortium's control worked and what weakened it. And they realized that the prison was filling with former contractors, that the consortium's retreat from direct operations hadn't stopped them from collecting debts, that they were systematically ensuring that people who broke free still faced legal consequences that would silence them, or at least limit their effectiveness as witnesses and resistors. It was a brilliant strategy in its cruelty. Use human justice systems to punish people for crimes committed under supernatural compulsion. Let society's own institutions do the work of silencing and containing the consortium's victims. Maintain plausible deniability while ensuring that resistance came with costs severe enough to discourage others from trying. Jackson counted 17 confirmed former contractors in Santa Fe prison alone, and correspondence with the resistance network revealed similar concentrations in territorial prisons across the West. Dozens of people serving time for consortium crimes, all of them potential witnesses and resistors if they could be organized effectively. Jackson proposed something audacious to Marshal Wade during one of his infrequent visits. What if they turned the prison into a training ground, a place where former contractors could learn resistance techniques, share knowledge, develop strategies that could be deployed when they were eventually released back into society? Wade was skeptical at first, argued that organizing convicted criminals for any purpose was dangerous and possibly illegal. But Jackson pointed out that the alternative was letting the consortium's victims rot in prisons while the consortium continued operations unopposed. And eventually, Wade agreed to discuss the idea with prison administrators who might be sympathetic. The warden, a pragmatic man named Samuel Cross, who'd been running Santa Fe prison for a decade, surprised everyone by being receptive to the proposal, not because he believed in supernatural evil, but because he'd noticed patterns among certain prisoners, men who showed signs of profound trauma despite claiming no memory of committing their crimes, men who woke screaming about puppet strings and stolen agency, men whose psychological profiles didn't match their convicted offenses in ways that troubled him professionally. If organizing these men helps them process their trauma and reduces violence in my prison, Warden Cross said with characteristic bluntness, then I don't care if they're talking about supernatural contracts or government conspiracies or alien abductions. So Jackson began teaching formally, holding sessions in the prison library where former contractors could gather and share experiences and learn techniques for maintaining agency in situations designed to strip it away. He taught them about recognizing consortium influence, about the psychology of contracts and consent, about building support networks that could sustain resistance over time, about documenting experiences in ways that could serve as evidence or warning to others. The sessions grew, drawing not just former contractors, but other prisoners who recognized something valuable in what Jackson was teaching, principles that applied to any situation where powerful forces tried to control people through exploitation of weakness or desperation. Sarah Mackenzie became a regular teacher too, traveling to Santa Fe monthly to lead discussions about community building and mutual support, about recognizing isolation as a weapon and connection as a defense,
about the practical work of resistance that didn't require supernatural understanding or personal history with the consortium. Her presence continued to have that strange effect of weakening supernatural influence, making it easier for former contractors to speak freely and think clearly, and nobody understood why, but everyone appreciated it, including guards and administrators who noticed that violence and tension dropped during her visits. 5 years into Jackson's sentence, he became eligible for parole, and the parole board hearing became another public sensation because Jackson's case had become symbolic of larger questions about justice and accountability and supernatural evil. The prosecution argued that Jackson remained dangerous despite his good behavior, that 15 years was the appropriate sentence for someone who'd murdered a good man regardless of mitigating circumstances, that early release would send the wrong message about taking responsibility for crimes committed under any circumstances. The defense, still led by Benjamin Carter, who'd become something of a crusader for former contractors, argued that Jackson had served his time and transformed it into something valuable, that he'd become a leader in helping others resist the consortium, that keeping him in prison served no purpose beyond vengeance. The parole board deliberated for a week, reviewing not just Jackson's prison record, but reports from Warden Cross about the programs Jackson had developed, testimony from Marshal Wade about the continued value of Jackson's knowledge in fighting the consortium, letters from dozens of former contractors who credited Jackson's teachings with helping them maintain their freedom and rebuild their lives. They granted parole conditionally, requiring Jackson to continue working with law enforcement on consortium investigations, to maintain his leadership role in the resistance network, to report monthly to a parole officer who would monitor his activities and ensure he wasn't returning to criminal behavior. Jackson walked out of Santa Fe prison on a Tuesday morning in early summer, 5 years after entering it, and found Sarah Mackenzie waiting with a horse and supplies and a letter from Daniel Garrett that Jackson almost couldn't bring himself to read. The letter was brief and formal, acknowledging that Jackson had paid his legal debt to society, expressing hope that Jackson's work helping other contractors would prevent future families from suffering what the Garrett family suffered, but stopping short of forgiveness or reconciliation because some debts transcend legal payment, and some wounds don't heal just because time passes.
Marshal Wade was waiting too, no longer a territorial marshal, but now working for a federal agency that had been created specifically to investigate and combat the consortium's operations. An agency that existed in legal gray areas, because how do you write laws about supernatural entities that exploit human weakness through contracts enforced by forces that exist partially outside reality? Wade offered Jackson a job, not as a sworn officer because his criminal record precluded that, but as a consultant and trainer, someone who could teach other investigators about the consortium's operations and help develop strategies for identifying and supporting contractors who were trying to break free. Jackson accepted because the work was the closest thing to redemption he'd found, because helping others escape the trap he'd fallen into felt like making restitution for the evil he'd been forced to commit, because fighting the consortium gave meaning to suffering that would otherwise have been purely destructive. He traveled the territories with Wade's agency, training investigators, interviewing suspected contractors, helping design interventions that could break consortium control before victims committed crimes that would ruin their lives. And the work was hard and often heartbreaking, but it was his work, chosen freely, undertaken with full consciousness and agency, which made it precious in ways people who'd never lost their freedom couldn't quite understand. If you're still watching this journey from damnation towards something that might eventually become redemption, leave a comment about whether justice was served in Jackson's case, whether 5 years in prison was enough for the crimes he committed even under compulsion, whether helping others escape the consortium's control constitutes adequate restitution for the lives he destroyed, Because we're approaching the final confrontation where Jackson faces not just the consortium, but the fundamental question of whether a man who sold his fate can ever truly buy it back. 2 years after his release, Jackson received word that Silas Blackwood wanted to meet, wanted to discuss terms that might end the conflict between Jackson's resistance network and the consortium's operations, wanted to negotiate a peace that would benefit both sides and prevent further escalation of a war that was becoming increasingly costly for everyone involved. Wade advised against meeting, argued that any negotiation with the consortium was a trap, that they didn't negotiate in good faith, and any appearance of compromise would actually be another mechanism of control. But Jackson felt he had to take the risk, had to explore any possibility of ending the consortium's predations, even if the chances of success were minimal, had to face Silas one final time to understand what he'd been fighting all these years, and whether victory was even possible in conventional terms. The meeting was arranged in Redemption Creek, in the ruins of the Silver Queen Saloon where Jackson had first met Silas 12 years earlier, where he'd signed a contract that had cost him 7 years of agency and 5 years of freedom and countless lives destroyed by actions he'd been forced to commit. The saloon was abandoned now, Redemption Creek having never recovered from the mine's closure, and Jackson walked through the door accompanied only by Sarah Mackenzie, because her presence seemed to provide some protection against the consortium's more subtle forms of manipulation. Silas was waiting at the same table where they'd first met, looking exactly the same as he'd looked 12 years ago, which confirmed he wasn't human in any conventional sense, wasn't aging or changing or showing any signs of physical mortality. His strange eyes tracked Jackson and Sarah as they approached, calculating and assessing, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same educated accent, with something underneath it that didn't quite fit with human speech patterns. "You've become a significant problem," Silas said without preamble. "More significant than we anticipated when you first broke your contract, because you've provided a template for resistance that other contractors are replicating, because you've created networks that immunize communities against our methods, because you've turned your suffering into a weapon against the systems we've spent centuries building. The consortium wants to offer you a final contract, one that would end hostilities, one that would benefit everyone involved if you're willing to consider terms that might seem unpalatable at first examination." Jackson didn't interrupt, just listened with the patience he'd learned during 5 years in prison and 2 years of investigation work. And Silas laid out an offer that was simultaneously seductive and horrifying in its implications. The consortium would cease all operations in the American territories, would release all current contractors from their obligations, would withdraw completely from direct intervention in human affairs within the boundaries of the United States, if Jackson agreed to stop teaching resistance, stop building networks, stop spreading information about the consortium's nature and methods, essentially to let the consortium operate freely in other parts of the world while pretending they didn't exist in this one. It was the same offer they'd made before the trial, dressed up in slightly different terms, and it carried the same impossible moral calculus. Trade the suffering of people Jackson would never meet for the freedom of people he'd worked directly with. Accept complicity in distant evil to prevent local evil. Choose which victims mattered enough to save and which could be sacrificed for the greater good. Sarah Mackenzie spoke before Jackson could respond, cutting through the offer with clarity that came from seeing the trap clearly because she was burdened by the guilt and responsibility Jackson carried. "You're not actually offering peace," Sarah said to Silas. "You're offering a different kind of war, one where Jackson spends the rest of his life wondering if he made the right choice, wondering whether the people you're victimizing elsewhere could have been saved if he'd refused your terms, wondering whether his silence makes him complicit in every terrible thing you do beyond the boundaries of his protection. You feed on that kind of moral corruption, on impossible choices that produce guilt regardless of what someone decides, and you're trying to use Jackson's conscience as a weapon against the very work that gives his suffering meaning. Silas's human mask slipped again, showing frustration or something approximating frustration in a being that didn't quite experience emotions the way humans did, and he turned his attention fully to Sarah Mackenzie, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You are the anomaly," he said with something like wonder. "The element we didn't account for when we designed Jackson's arc from corruption to damnation. The variable that changed outcomes we thought were predetermined. And we still don't understand what you are or how you affect our operations, but we know you're dangerous in ways that transcend normal human resistance." Sarah smiled, not kindly, and explained something that Jackson had suspected but never quite articulated, that the consortium's power depended on isolation and disconnection, on victims believing they were alone in their suffering and unique in their circumstances, on the psychological conviction that resistance was impossible and complicity was inevitable. "And I'm the opposite of that," Sarah continued. "I'm connection and witness and the refusal to accept that anyone's suffering is inevitable or deserved. And apparently that's somehow toxic to whatever you actually are underneath the human costume you're wearing."
Jackson found his voice then, made his decision without the agonizing deliberation he'd expected, and spoke with the authority of someone who'd paid terrible prices for wisdom he'd never wanted. "I'm refusing your offer," he told Silas, "not because I don't care about contractors in other territories or other countries, not because I want them to suffer, but because accepting your terms would mean accepting the premise that evil is inevitable, and the best we can do is negotiate its boundaries, and I don't accept that premise anymore. Won't accept it even if refusing costs me everything, including my life." Silas stood, and the room darkened in ways that had nothing to do with natural light, and his human form flickered, showing glimpses of what existed underneath, something vast and cold and utterly inhuman that regarded humanity the way humans might regard bacteria, as things that existed to serve functions in larger processes that they couldn't comprehend and wouldn't survive comprehending. "You're declaring war," Silas said flatly, "declaring that you'll continue building resistance networks and teaching contractors how to break free and spreading information that makes our operations harder and less profitable. And you understand that means we'll treat you as an active threat rather than a contained inconvenience." Jackson understood, accepted it, had been preparing for this moment since he first broken free from the consortium's control 7 years ago, and he responded with something he'd learned from 5 years of teaching former contractors in Santa Fe prison and 2 years of building resistance networks across the territories. "I'm not declaring war," he corrected. "I'm continuing a war that started the moment your consortium first decided to exploit human weakness for inhuman purposes. And I'm doing it with the knowledge that I might not win, that you might ultimately destroy me and everyone I care about, but that fighting is better than collaborating, that resistance is better than complicity, that choosing to stand against evil is valuable regardless of whether the standing accomplishes anything measurable." Silas's form solidified back into human appearance, calculation replacing whatever anger or frustration he'd shown, and he delivered what sounded like both prophecy and warning. "The consortium will target everyone in your network," he said calmly. "We'll use every method we've developed over centuries to corrupt and control and destroy the people you're trying to save. We'll turn your work against itself until you're drowning in the consequences of trying to help, and we'll do it all while making it look like natural human evil, like choices people made freely, like nothing supernatural was ever involved." Jackson had expected something like this.
had warned his network participants that resistance came with costs, that the consortium wouldn't surrender their operations easily, that fighting back meant accepting vulnerability and risk that most people would consider unacceptable. But he'd also learned that the consortium's threats were often more psychological than practical, designed to create fear that did their work for them, designed to make resistance seem more dangerous and costly than it actually was. So he called Silas's bluff, challenged the consortium to do their worst, and promised that every attack would be documented, every attempt at corruption would be exposed, every contractor they tried to punish would be supported by networks too distributed and connected to be easily infiltrated or destroyed. Silas disappeared then, not walking out but simply ceasing to be present, and the darkness lifted from the ruined saloon, leaving Jackson and Sarah alone with the weight of what they'd just committed to. A war against forces that existed partially outside reality, a fight they might not win but had to undertake anyway because the alternative was accepting that evil was inevitable and resistance was pointless. They sat in silence for a few minutes, processing what had happened and what it meant, and finally Sarah spoke with the practical concern that characterized her approach to even the most extraordinary circumstances. "We need to warn the network," she said simply. "Need to prepare people for what's coming. Need to build stronger connections and better support systems so when the consortium attacks we can respond collectively rather than letting them isolate and destroy us individually." Jackson agreed, pulled out the journal he'd been keeping since his days in Santa Fe prison, and they began planning a response to threats they couldn't fully predict but knew would come. Threats designed to test whether human resistance could actually survive against inhuman evil, or whether Jackson's rebellion would ultimately produce only more suffering and corruption. Before we get to the final confrontation and resolution of Jackson's story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment about whether fighting unwinnable wars is courage or madness, whether humans can actually resist forces that exist beyond human comprehension, whether Jackson's choice to refuse the consortium's offer was heroic or selfish, or some combination that defies easy categorization, because what happens next will test everything we've learned about resistance and redemption and the price of reclaiming faith from forces designed to steal it. The consortium's counterattack began within a week. Subtle at first, but escalating rapidly, targeting not Jackson directly, but everyone connected to the resistance network. Everyone who'd trusted Jackson's teaching and relied on his guidance to maintain their freedom from supernatural compulsion. Former contractors started reporting new contacts, new offers, temptations carefully designed to exploit individual weaknesses and specific vulnerabilities, promises of help with problems that seemed overwhelming, threats against family members who could only be protected through cooperation with consortium representatives. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, exploiting the very connections that made the resistance network strong, turning relationships into pressure points and support into leverage. Marshal Wade's federal agency tried to provide protection, assigning investigators to monitor high-risk network members, but the consortium's methods were too subtle for conventional law enforcement, worked through influences that looked like natural human interaction, left no evidence that would stand up in court even when everyone involved knew supernatural forces were at work. 3 former contractors were arrested within 2 weeks on charges that seemed legitimate but circumstantial, evidence appearing from nowhere, witnesses coming forward with testimony that couldn't be easily disproven, and Jackson recognized the pattern. The consortium was using human justice systems to attack the network the same way they'd used those systems to punish Jackson and Robert Ashford and dozens of others who'd broken free from their control. The resistance network responded by going more public, holding meetings in churches and community halls, inviting local authorities and newspaper reporters to witness what they were doing and why, making it harder for the consortium to operate in shadows when their targets were surrounded by witnesses and documentation. Jackson gave interviews explaining the consortium's methods, published articles in newspapers that reached beyond the territories, testified before territorial legislatures about the need for legal frameworks that could address supernatural threats to human agency and consent. It wasn't enough to stop the attacks, but it slowed them, made them more costly, forced the consortium to be more careful about how they applied pressure to network members. Sarah Mackenzie proved invaluable during this period, traveling constantly to support network members under attack, and her presence continued to weaken the consortium's supernatural influence in ways nobody understood but everyone could observe. People under pressure found it easier to resist when Sarah was nearby, found their thinking clearer and their resolve stronger, found they could see through temptations and threats that seemed overwhelming when faced alone. The consortium tried to target Sarah directly several times, offering her contracts that would give her power to protect others more effectively, but she refused every offer with a simplicity that seemed to baffle beings who thought everyone had a price or breaking point.
6 months into the consortium's counterattack, something happened that changed the nature of the war completely and revealed possibilities Jackson hadn't considered about what human resistance could actually accomplish against inhuman evil. A former contractor named Michael Torres, who'd been serving 20 years in a Colorado prison for crimes committed under consortium compulsion, managed to do something unprecedented. He broke not just his own contract, but the contracts of 3 other inmates who'd been struggling to resist consortium influence, somehow extending his own hard-won freedom to others in a way that suggested resistance might be contagious in ways the consortium hadn't anticipated. Jackson traveled to Colorado immediately to interview Michael and understand what had happened, and what he learned revolutionized his understanding of how resistance actually worked and why the consortium was so threatened by the network he'd built. Michael explained that he'd been practicing the techniques Jackson taught, maintaining his freedom through constant vigilance and connection with other former contractors, when he'd suddenly felt something shift during a group discussion in the prison library, felt like the boundaries between individual consciousness had become permeable in some way, felt like the freedom he'd fought for could be shared directly with others who were fighting similar battles. "It sounds insane when I try to explain it," Michael told Jackson. "Sounds like mystical nonsense or wishful thinking, but I swear I could feel their struggles, could feel the consortium's control over them, and I could somehow push against that control from outside, could add my will to theirs in ways that made resistance easier for everyone involved." It was like the network isn't just metaphorical, like the connections between former contractors create something real that exists in the same spaces the consortium operates in, something that can push back against their influence directly instead of just teaching people to resist individually. Jackson tested Michael's theory with other network members, organizing sessions where former contractors gathered specifically to support someone under active consortium pressure, focusing collective attention and will on helping that person resist specific temptations or threats. And the results were undeniable, even if they were impossible to measure objectively. People under consortium attack reported that group support made resistance dramatically easier, that they could feel something like protective presence surrounding them during critical moments, that choices which had seemed impossible when faced alone became manageable when faced with collective backing from others who understood what they were experiencing. The consortium noticed, escalated their attacks, started targeting network gatherings directly, but the more they pushed, the stronger the collective resistance became, like pressure was forging connections between former contractors into something more solid and effective than individual rebellion. Jackson realized they'd stumbled onto something the consortium genuinely feared, not individual resistance, which they could contain through legal consequences and social isolation, but collective resistance that created spaces where their influence was actively weakened or blocked, where human connection became a weapon against inhuman predation. Sarah Mackenzie provided the theoretical framework that helped everyone understand what was happening, drawing on research into group psychology and social movements and religious experiences where collective consciousness produces effects that transcend individual capability. "We're creating sacred space," she explained during a network gathering in Denver, "creating areas where the consortium's influence can't reach because human connection and mutual support generate something that exists in the same dimensions they operate in, but with opposite effects. Building instead of destroying, connecting instead of isolating, liberating instead of enslaving." The network began organizing more deliberately around this discovery, creating permanent gathering spaces, establishing regular support sessions, building what amounted to resistance sanctuaries where people under consortium pressure could find refuge and reinforcement, where former contractors could maintain their freedom through constant connection with others fighting similar battles. The spaces weren't magical or supernatural in obvious ways, they were just rooms where people gathered and supported each other, but something about them made consortium influence weaker, made resistance easier, made freedom more sustainable over time. Jackson documented everything as always, recording testimonies and theories and observations, sending reports to Marshall Wade's agency and to researchers at universities who were beginning to take seriously the idea that human consciousness might interact with reality in ways conventional science hadn't fully mapped. The work was slow and often frustrating because most people still dismissed the consortium as conspiracy theory or religious superstition, but enough evidence was accumulating that dismissal was becoming harder, that mainstream institutions were starting to develop interest in understanding phenomena they'd previously ignored or explained away. The consortium's response to these developments was revealing in its desperation. They started offering increasingly extreme contracts to people they'd never have approached before, targeting stable individuals with good support systems, people who weren't obviously desperate or vulnerable, people who by all conventional measures shouldn't have been susceptible to predatory offers. Jackson recognized it as a sign that the consortium's traditional recruitment methods were failing, that communities educated about their tactics were producing fewer vulnerable targets, that resistance was actually working to reduce the consortium's operational effectiveness in measurable ways. But the most significant development came a year after the war had escalated to its current intensity, when Daniel Garrett requested a meeting with Jackson for the first time since Thomas's murder 13 years earlier. And what Daniel had to say would change Jackson's understanding of everything he'd been fighting for, and everything he still needed to do to truly break free from the consortium's influence. Make sure you're subscribed and comment below about whether redemption requires forgiveness from victims or just sincere effort to repair damage you've caused, because Daniel's message to Jackson contains revelations about Thomas Garrett's death and the consortium's operations that will force Jackson to confront the possibility that his worst crime might not be what he thought it was. That breaking free from the consortium means understanding truths he's been avoiding since the moment he pulled the trigger 13 years ago. Daniel Garrett met Jackson in Redemption Creek's cemetery, standing at Thomas's grave marker, which had weathered 13 years of frontier sun and wind. At his first words weren't angry or accusatory, but sad in ways that transcended simple grief. "I found something in Thomas's papers,"
Daniel said without preamble. Something he'd hidden because he knew it would destroy me if I learned it while I was still drowning in anger about his death. Something that changes everything about why he died and what your role actually was in the consortium's plans. Jackson waited, unsure what revelation could possibly change the fundamental fact that he'd pulled the trigger, that Thomas had died because Jackson's hand had drawn his Colt faster than mercy. But Daniel continued with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed these words many times. Thomas knew about the consortium, had been investigating them for 2 years before his death, had identified Silas Blackwood, and had tracked patterns of violence and corruption back to contracts signed by desperate people who didn't understand what they were agreeing to. He knew you were one of their contractors, had evidence of assignments you'd completed, had documented your movements and actions enough that he could have exposed you and the consortium if he'd gone public with what he'd learned. The implications hit Jackson like physical blows, rewriting his understanding of everything that had happened. Because if Thomas had known about Jackson and the consortium, then his murder wasn't just random violence in service of the consortium's business interests. It was specifically designed to silence someone who threatened their operations while simultaneously deepening Jackson's corruption by making him murder someone who'd been trying to help people like him. Daniel confirmed this with documents he'd brought, Thomas's research showing connections Jackson had never seen, evidence that Silas had deliberately positioned Jackson to murder Thomas specifically because Thomas represented a threat, and because forcing Jackson to kill an investigator who understood supernatural compulsion would damage Jackson's psychology in ways that pure random violence wouldn't. Thomas was trying to help you, Daniel said quietly, was trying to figure out how to break consortium control, had theories about resistance techniques that sound a lot like what you eventually developed on your own. And the consortium killed him not just to protect their operations, but to hurt you specifically, to make you complicit in destroying the very help you needed, to corrupt you so deeply that breaking free would seem impossible. Jackson felt like the ground was dissolving beneath him, felt like 13 years of carefully constructed understanding was collapsing, because this meant his worst crime had been even more terrible than he'd realized. He'd been used to murder someone who'd been fighting the same enemy, who might have been able to help him break free years earlier, who died trying to protect others from the consortium's predations. The guilt was crushing, overwhelming, worse than anything Jackson had felt during 7 years of forced servitude, or 5 years in prison, or 2 years of resistance work. Because this guilt came with the knowledge that the consortium had specifically designed Thomas's death to produce maximum psychological damage. But Daniel wasn't finished. Pulled out more documents that showed Thomas had suspected he was being targeted, had written letters to be opened after his death, letters that included instructions for Daniel about how to continue the investigation and how to help contractors break free if the opportunity arose. Thomas knew he might die, Daniel explained, knew the consortium eliminated threats, but he chose to keep investigating anyway because he believed stopping them was worth dying for, believed that understanding how they operated was valuable enough to justify risking everything. One of Thomas's letters was addressed to Jackson specifically, written 2 days before his murder, and Daniel handed it over with hands that shook slightly from emotion he'd been containing for 13 years. Jackson opened it with the feeling of standing at the edge of an abyss, and Thomas's handwriting was neat and steady as he explained that he knew about Jackson's contract, knew about the consortium's control, knew that Jackson had committed terrible acts while puppeted by inhuman forces, and he forgave Jackson for whatever might happen because he understood that consciousness without agency wasn't true culpability, that being forced to watch yourself commit evil was a torture worse than physical punishment. "If you're reading this," Thomas's letter concluded, "then I'm dead.
And you probably killed me. And I want you to know that I don't hold you responsible, that I understand you're a victim, even as you're forced to be a weapon, that my death might ultimately serve a purpose if it helps you or others break free from the consortium's control, and I forgive you completely and without reservation for anything you were compelled to do to me or my family." Jackson couldn't read the rest through tears that blurred the words and choked his breathing, couldn't process the magnitude of grace being offered by a man he'd murdered, couldn't understand how Thomas could forgive him for something Jackson couldn't forgive himself for. And Daniel put a hand on Jackson's shoulder with surprising gentleness considering their history. "He forgave you 13 years ago," Daniel said quietly. "Forgave you before you even killed him. And I've spent 13 years trying to understand how he could do that, how he could extend grace to someone who was about to murder him. And I think I finally understand that forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened or pretending it wasn't terrible. It's about refusing to let the consortium's evil create more evil, refusing to let their corruption poison more relationships, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching Thomas's death destroy both his killer and his family." Daniel explained that he was ready to forgive Jackson too, not because Jackson deserved it or because the pain had faded, but because continuing to hate Jackson gave the consortium exactly what they wanted, gave them power over both Daniel and Jackson, kept them both imprisoned by an act that had been designed specifically to create this kind of lasting damage. "I've watched you fight them for the past 8 years, watched you build resistance networks, watched you help other victims break free, watched you turn your suffering into something that saves people, and I think Thomas would be proud of what you've become, even though he had to die for you to get there."
The cemetery was quiet, except for wind moving through abandoned buildings, and Jackson tried to find words for gratitude or remorse that matched the magnitude of what Daniel was offering. But everything he thought to say seemed inadequate, seemed to diminish the gift Daniel and Thomas were giving him. So he just nodded, accepted the forgiveness he didn't deserve, let it begin healing wounds he'd thought were permanent, and they stood together at Thomas's grave in silence that said more than speeches could have said about grief and grace and the possibility of redemption, even for people who've committed unconscionable acts under impossible circumstances. Finally, Jackson found words, simple ones, insufficient but sincere. "I'm going to destroy them," he told Daniel, told Thomas's grave, told the wind and the ghosts and whatever forces might be listening, going to dismantle the consortium's operations piece by piece, going to make sure no one else signs contracts that steal their fate, going to fight until I'm dead or they're broken. And I'm doing it not for redemption or forgiveness, but because it's the only way to make Thomas's death mean something. The only way to honor his choice to risk everything to help people he'd never met. Daniel nodded, offered to help however he could, and together they began planning a final offensive against the consortium, gathering resources and allies and evidence, preparing for a confrontation that would either break the consortium's power permanently or destroy everyone involved in the attempt. It was ambitious to the point of madness, was probably doomed to failure, but it was also the only path forward that didn't involve accepting that evil was inevitable and resistance was pointless. And after everything Jackson had survived and learned and become, acceptance of inevitable evil was the one thing he absolutely refused to consider. If you've made it this far in Jackson's story, drop that like button and leave a comment about what you think happens next, whether humans can actually defeat forces that exist partially outside reality, whether Jackson's sacrifice and resistance will ultimately matter or just produce more suffering. Because we're entering the final act where everything converges, and Jackson faces the ultimate cost of reclaiming his fate from devils who thought they owned it forever.
The final offensive against the consortium took a year to organize, bringing together former contractors, federal investigators, sympathetic journalists, academics researching supernatural phenomena, and community organizers who'd been building resistance networks across the territories and beyond. Jackson coordinated from Redemption Creek, which had become the unofficial headquarters of the resistance movement, its abandoned buildings repurposed into meeting halls and safe houses and documentation centers where survivors could tell their stories and find support from others who understood what they'd endured. Marshall Wade's federal agency provided official backing, though they had to operate carefully because most government officials still didn't believe the consortium existed as anything more than an elaborate criminal conspiracy, didn't accept that supernatural contracts and inhuman forces were anything but metaphors for ordinary corruption and coercion. But Wade had accumulated enough evidence over 8 years of investigation that even skeptics had to admit something unusual was happening. Patterns of violence and fraud that seemed coordinated beyond normal criminal capability, testimony from dozens of contractors that matched too precisely to be fabricated, phenomena that conventional psychology couldn't adequately explain. The strategy was multi-pronged, combining legal action with public exposure, community organizing with direct intervention, conventional law enforcement with techniques developed specifically for countering supernatural influence. They filed lawsuits against consortium front companies in multiple jurisdictions, forcing the entities behind those companies to appear in court and defend themselves against accusations of fraud and coercion and conspiracy. They published comprehensive reports in major newspapers from San Francisco to New York, documenting the consortium's history and methods and providing warnings about contracts that seemed too good to be true. They established support centers in cities across the country where people could report suspicious offers and receive help resisting pressure to sign predatory agreements. Most importantly, they expanded the resistance sanctuary network, creating permanent spaces where the consortium's influence was actively weakened by collective human will and mutual support, where former contractors could maintain their freedom through constant connection with others fighting similar battles. These sanctuaries became the backbone of the resistance, providing proof that the consortium's power wasn't absolute, that human agency could be reclaimed and defended, that communities organized around transparency and mutual aid were resistant to the kind of manipulation the consortium specialized in. The consortium responded with escalating violence, targeting resistance leaders directly, and 3 organizers were murdered in circumstances that looked like robbery or accident, but that everyone involved recognized as consortium reprisals. Jackson added their names to a growing list of people who died fighting the consortium, people whose sacrifice demanded that the resistance succeed, because failure would mean their deaths accomplished nothing except making the consortium more careful about who they targeted. Sarah Mackenzie continued to be the anomaly the consortium couldn't account for, the element that disrupted their calculations and weakened their influence in ways that suggested possibilities Jackson was only beginning to understand. She proposed something radical during a strategy meeting 8 months into the offensive, that they attempt a direct confrontation with the consortium's core operations, whatever those actually were, using the collective will of former contractors to push into spaces where the consortium exists most fully, spaces adjacent to normal reality where their true nature might be more vulnerable to human resistance. It was dangerous to the point of suicidal, potentially fatal for everyone involved, but Jackson recognized it as the logical extension of everything they'd learned about resistance. If collective human will could create sanctuaries that weakened the consortium influence, then maybe collective human will focused and directed could actually damage or destroy the consortium's operational capacity in more fundamental ways. He put the proposal